The story is told of an individual who was a volunteer with his local ambulance corps. And they were responding to a call one evening, and they had their lights and their sirens on as they made their way to the emergency situation. And they came up along behind a car in front, a car that failed to pull over to the right-hand side of the road so that the ambulance could go on by. Now, this was, of course, much to the annoyance of the volunteer and the driver of the ambulance, because no matter what they would do, they could not get this car to pull over to the right-hand side. And so the driver, they made the decision in annoyance and frustration to take the PA system and to speak into it, saying these words, "Please pull over to the side of the road." The driver pulled over quite quickly, let the ambulance by. It went on. They went about their business at the emergency situation. And then afterwards, they were on their way back to base, following the same route. And as they drove along that same road, they noticed that the very same car that they had invited to pull over was still parked in exactly the same place where they had asked them to do that. Well, of course, they thought something was wrong with the situation, so they pulled the ambulance over, made their way over to the car, and they found the driver just sitting there, looking up at them and smiling quite innocently. They questioned the driver to see what was going on, and the driver just calmly explained to them, "Oh, God told me to pull over on the road, and so I pulled over on the road, and God hasn't yet told me to move on, so I'm staying until God does." Well, the crew smiled, and then they started to explain to her that it was actually them who had invited her to pull over on the road because they had an emergency call. But this driver was very insistent that it was the voice of God that had spoken and that nothing was going to happen until that voice spoke again. The crew were realizing, of course, that they were not going to persuade the driver otherwise. And so they got back into the ambulance, turned it around on the road, pulled in behind that car, got back onto the PA and said, "You may now continue on your way." And of course, the driver pulled off immediately and went on her way. This idea of God's call is one that we hear of often. We have perhaps experienced the call of God in our own lives. We've heard God speaking. We have listened, and we have been able to articulate that call or to tell the story of it. Or perhaps we have listen to the stories of others as they have told us about a time when God called them. And of course, for anyone who has been going to church services for any real amount of time in their lives, they will know that the idea of God's call is one that comes up often throughout the Bible. Think of Moses at the burning bush, or think of Isaiah and his heavenly vision and call. Think of Esther, called for such a time as this. Mary, visited by the angel Gabriel. Think of Paul on the road to Damascus. Think of Noah, who was told it was going to rain and he had to build a boat. All of these are names of individuals that we will recognize, because when their stories are told in the Bible, there's a testimony of call within them. This passage that we have read today, the calling story of Samuel in the Old Testament, is one of my favorite stories from the entire Bible. For years, I have enjoyed telling this story, particularly to groups of young children, just as Pastor Carey did for us a few moments ago. I love to help them to interact and to engage with the moments when God is calling and Samuel is working out what's going on. And I always love to try and teach them in that moment that just as God was calling the boy Samuel all of those years ago, God might well be calling them too, even at their young age. I can still remember hearing this story as a young boy in my own Sunday school setting, and it has stayed there in my memory ever since. I love to read this story, I love to tell this story, and I love to engage with what is going on in this story. And over the years, I have thought an awful lot about what's going on in the story of Samuel's call. And I've had some reflections about what it means for God's call in our own lives. And as you might suspect, in the time of a sermon and a service, I would love to share some of those reflections with you. The first thing that I learn or think about in terms of God's call when I read this story is this: that God is never without a witness. God is never without a witness in any time, any place, any circumstance. And that is because God is a God who calls. God is a God who calls witnesses to the work of storytelling and prophesying in all ages and in all places. And we see that right here in this text when we read those words as they are written in verse 3, that the lamp of God had not yet gone out. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Now, those words stood out to me as I got ready for this sermon this week, as I was reading through that text, and I went to find out what some of the Bible commentators really think that these words mean, and they have a few different conclusions as to what they might actually mean. Some of them say that this lamp of God is actually representative of a candle, a literal candle that was lit every night in the tabernacle and was allowed to burn through the night and usually burned itself out before the light of morning came up. Those commentators would say that the purpose of including these words in this telling of the story is so that you and I, the reader of the text, know that all of this is happening during the nighttime hours. But there are other commentators out there who would recognize this lamp of God as being the lamp of prophecy. And they say that in Eli, Samuel's teacher and mentor, in Eli, the lamp of God's prophetic voice to the community was not yet extinct. Now, Eli was a little bit older, and his ministry was certainly moving towards its earthly end. And God's work in this moment in the text was a work of ensuring that the lamp of God's prophetic work in the world would not go out. Before one sun was set, another sun arose, because the Lord is never without a witness. Now, we all know that these times are difficult and straining. I feel like I say that about 6 times every single week. And in such times, it is tempting for us to begin to think that God is nowhere to be found, that the lamp of God's voice has gone out. Well, of course, many people are trying to speak for God in these days, but, and please forgive me for this, it seems like there are times when those who claim to be speaking for God and those who are doing it loudest are saying things that are anything but godly and are so far removed from the way of the Lamb. It is tempting for you and I and anyone else to think that God has departed and left us to it. But the lamp of God has not yet gone out, and it never does. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The Lord is never without a witness. God is always calling God's people to speak up and to act right in the world, to be light in the darkness, and to remind the world around us that the lamp of God has not yet gone out. But in Samuel's story, we learn another thing, and this is what it is. We learn that inasmuch as God is calling, well, there are times when we just don't hear it. Samuel hears his voice 3 times and does not work out what is going on in the moment. Now, of course, that is forgivable because, as the text goes on to tell us, the Lord had not yet been revealed to Samuel. Samuel was not of a personal awareness as to who God was for his life and what God might be doing in this moment. But Eli, his teacher, his mentor, Eli knew God well. And it also took him 3 times to work out that being woken up in the middle of the night by the boy, what was happening was that God was calling. Sometimes we just don't recognize what God is saying or doing in our midst, and we miss the call of God in our lives. And let's be honest as well, there are times also when God is calling us and we are just ignoring God's voice in our lives, ignoring what God is saying, hoping that God will soon tire of God's pursuit of us and will stop calling soon enough. And then there are those other times when we know that God is calling, when we know exactly what God is saying, and we just outright defy it in our lives. That might be out of fear, of course. It might be because we disagree with God on a matter and we don't think that God has quite got it right in speaking to us and calling us, or that we don't think that we have the abilities needed to do what God is calling us to do. Or of course, it might just be that we just don't want to do what God is asking us to do. But here's the thing. Whether we're having trouble hearing the voice of God in our lives, or whether we are just being oppositional to the call of God in our lives, this one thing is for sure. God doesn't stop calling. Samuel. 3 times God calls, and then a 4th when Samuel finally has been instructed how to respond in terms of what is going on. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, says Jesus. And I hear those words and I think of the times when I have heard that knocking and I haven't opened the door, and Jesus just never stops knocking. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Zacchaeus, come down from that tree today. I've got to come to your house. There were dozens of reasons why Jesus should not have been talking to Zacchaeus that day. There was a crowd in the way. Zacchaeus was not the most popular of characters. There were dozens of reasons why Jesus should not have been there. And yet he makes his way through the crowd to the sycamore tree, looks up and says, Zacchaeus, I've got to come to your house today. This is your moment. I'm calling you, Zacchaeus. Whether you don't believe it, whether you don't like it, whether you're ignoring it or just not comprehending it, none of that seems to matter. When God is calling, God is calling, and God is going to keep on calling. And if God keeps on calling and we are having some trouble getting that, the third thing that we learn from Samuel's call story is that sometimes we just need a little bit of help in understanding what's going on. The boy Samuel needed the understanding and the wisdom and direction of his mentor and teacher Eli in order to begin to get what was happening that night. When the old man realized what was happening, he knew exactly what instruction to give. Samuel, go back to bed, and the next time this happens, sit up and respond by saying, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Sometimes we need help to comprehend what God is doing in the world, what God is speaking into our lives. That's why God never calls us into this journey alone. That's why we have the church, the community of God's people gathered together in fellowship and friendship and worship. Even in times when we cannot gather in person, the most important thing that we could do in these times was to find a way to gather even virtually, to make time and to make space to seek God's way together in the world. That's why God gives us pastors and teachers and mentors to help us along the way, to help us perceive when God is calling. You know, this past year, one of the primary mentoring voices in my own life, Glenn. He passed away back in April. And I can remember one of the most significant moments of mentorship that he gave to me. It was back in 2013. Margaret and I had been given this opportunity to return to the United States once more, probably permanently. And we were wrestling a bit as to what that would mean and whether or not God was specifically calling us at this specific time to return to the United States. And so I sat with Glenn over coffee one day and I explained my predicament to him. And he said, Charlie, catch yourself on and wise up. You know what? If you go to the United States to live, God's going to be there. You're going to serve God. And if you stay here in Northern Ireland, you know what? God's going to be here and you're going to serve God here. Charlie, stop messing around with this and make up your mind and decide what you are going to do, because God's going to be with you. To this day, that has stayed with me. We need the voices of others in our lives to help us sometimes perceive what God is calling us to. But then perhaps the biggest lesson that we need to glean from Samuel's call story is this. When we do realize that God is speaking into our lives, when we do realize that God is calling us in a moment, our only response can be that which Eli instructed Samuel to make. To sit up and say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Speak. Speak, because you are a God who speaks to God's people. Speak, Lord, because you are my Lord. I've given my life to you, and I want to listen to what it is you have to say. Speak, Lord, because your servant is listening. I have given my life to you. I will go where you want me to go. I will say what you want me to say. I will do what you call me to do. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. We've mentioned already today that this is Martin Luther King weekend. Weekend set apart every single year in our calendars to remember the life and the legacy and the writings and the teachings and the ideas of Dr. Martin Luther King, who gave his entire life to making sure that those who were listening to him knew all of the merits of an attitude of nonviolence in the world. Making sure that all who would listen to him knew the importance of equality and justice for all people in our nation and in our world. That call was tested time and time again as King was rejected in some quarters, threatened in other quarters, as his family was threatened too. And yet, Dr. King continued to get up each day to write his writings and to say the things that he had to say and to lead his people in the march for civil rights. And Dr. King could only do that because at some point in his life, Dr. King had experienced a call from God. A call to learn, to be educated, to write, to preach, to lead. A call which sustained him through all of those other voices of opposition. He says of his call, "My call to the ministry was not a miraculous or supernatural something. On the contrary, it was an inner urge calling me to serve humanity." The call of God in our lives, individually and collectively as a church, is something which is very real, my friends. And so with this story in mind that we've read together from the scripture today, the story of call, I invite you to ask the question now. Where's the voice of God speaking in your life? Where's the call of God being made in our life together? Is it a call which is pushing us hard or challenging us or stretching us? Is it a call which is inviting us to speak up and speak out about something? Is it a call which is inviting us into a new life? How is God calling you today, my friends? Because make no mistake, The Lord is never without a witness. God is always calling, always speaking. And even if we need help to comprehend and understand what it is that God is saying it to us right now. He's saying it to you right now. So I invite you, as God speaks, to make your own response to God. And I would hope that all of us will follow on the advice of Eli to the boy Samuel. That as we hear God calling, we will sit up and we will say, "Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening, and we are willing and ready to walk in your way and to follow your call in our lives." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.